envoy since 2013, and so Mike's. You'll know Mike mainly for his role as New Zealand's the chairman of Beef and Lamb New Zealand. I think you might still be chairman of Ron's, are you?
Oh, no, I'm not chairman of Ron's, no. So Andy's done his homework here, hasn't he? You can tell this.
He's also on the board of ANZCO. And but the key thing about Mike is that he's still in between these trips away around the world. He's still a hands-on farmer, so he understands what's going on. He's involved in governance in a big business, a big farming business up on the east coast of the hill country, North Island. So he understands sheep and beef. He's had several farming awards over the years, so he knows what he's doing. My big challenge is with Mike's deer fencing with no deer behind him, is to get him back into a few deer. But given the lack of weaners at the moment, maybe we'll wait for about 3 years to get the hind numbers up before we get you back into finishing. So hand over. Looking forward to it, Mike. Thanks,
Andy. And I think the price of mixed sex weaners in Taiapi last week was about $5.80 a kilo. Is that right? So that's a bit of a challenge. Look, Andy, thanks for the introduction. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. Look, Tony did a great job, I think, talking around succession. And I think, he certainly made it sexy, didn't he? He was talking about sex education. Did you see a young housemaid, was it up there? I saw the young housemaid, Tony, so I'm not sure what that says about me, except that my mother-in-law is Angus Irvine's mother. So maybe that was a good thing, because I didn't want to make any associations there. But look, it's certainly good to be here, certainly good to talk about trade. I'd spent about 3 or 4 hours putting together a presentation for you today. And then I got down and talked to you all last night, and I realised it was completely out of the area that you wanted to hear. So I jotted down a few notes this morning, and everyone tells me that you want to hear more about the big picture, more about the trade opportunities, and really get a bit of an outside perspective about what's happening in the world. So look, happy to do that and hopefully set the scene and then provide some more time for some questions and discussion, which I think might be of interest as well. Excellent. So look, firstly, my role. A couple of people asked me last night, they said, what the hell do you do? And I said, well, actually, I don't travel incessantly all the time offshore, as some would believe, even though it looks like it from the media at times. I travel about 6 times a year offshore as New Zealand's Special Agricultural Trade Envoy. It's a very wordy title. When I was appointed to the role, I tried to get it shortened, but in diplomatic terms, if you're a special envoy, apparently it makes a difference. So that's what it's called, New Zealand Special Agricultural Trade Envoy. And it does open doors. I'm appointed by the Ministers of Trade and the Minister for Primary Industries into this role, but my role is quite unique. And in fact, this is something that other countries around the world really appreciate and almost struggle to understand, because I'm appointed by the government to represent the primary sector. I'm not there to represent the government viewpoint, and I have meetings overseas with ambassadors where the ambassador will have one view around light-handed regulation in the primary sector in New Zealand, and I'll say, well, actually, that's not quite correct, Ambassador, So it's quite a nice tension to be able to have, is to obviously feel very passionately about what New Zealand is and how we do things in the world, but equally to have the view from the private sector, the primary sector, about what really matters when it comes to trade offshore. So I represent effectively what we'd say sort of 6 main sectors: dairy, sheep, beef and deer, horticulture and wine. And I sometimes do forestry and seafood as well. So there's only one of me, so I'm pretty thin on the ground, but I certainly try and get right across the issues where I can when I'm offshore. And when I'm offshore, I'm meeting with everyone from ministers down to officials and bureaucrats, down to stakeholder groups and sector groups, right down to farmers. And so that actually gives me a really good breadth of understanding, a good opportunity to talk with the people at all levels of international trade and markets around what's happening and what New Zealand really is in the world. So that's what I do. The rest of the time, as Andy says, I'm farming. Whangaroa Farms on the East Coast I'm involved with. Totally Vets, I'm an advisor to their board, and I'm doing a number of other things around in governance roles, as Andy said, with ANZCO as well. But in this trade envoy role, I'm strictly as New Zealand's Special Agricultural Trade Envoy, and talking about the wider primary sector issues. I just want to put New Zealand into context for a minute. because I think this is really important, and I get frustrated when I read some of the media here at home and some of the internal squabbles we have here at home. So remember, New Zealand's a population of 4.6 million people, about the same size as the population of Sydney. Okay? Produce enough food for about 40 million people, which is why we export about 90% of what we produce. So New Zealand relies on the world for a living, but if New Zealand fell off the world tomorrow, no one would notice. So it's why we have to work hard, really, really hard. It's why we have to be really demanding about getting into markets offshore, about influencing people offshore. Because for any other country in the world, nothing matters like access to markets, and particularly for agricultural goods like New Zealand. There's no other country in the world that has the same trade profile that New Zealand has. Because if we fell off the world tomorrow, frankly, the world would not notice. Even in dairy, and I make this point to the dairy farmers. Next week I'm talking to supposedly 1,000 dairy farmers at Mystery Creek. The trouble with dairy is that everyone thinks dairy in New Zealand's big. New Zealand dairy is 3% of global production. 3%. We produce 20 billion litres of milk in New Zealand. Europe's 165 billion litres and growing at about 3% per annum. Okay, America's about 95 billion litres. If New Zealand was a country in Europe, we would still only be the third biggest producer in Europe, behind Germany and France. So I often think in New Zealand, when we talk about scaling up and going and taking our products to the world, we're not serious, surely, about scale from New Zealand, being able to dominate and set prices. Our meat industry gets a particularly hard time here in New Zealand because there's an expectation here that they can set the global price, for meat products. There's an expectation here that Fonterra or the dairy industry can set the global price for dairy products. But New Zealand's only 30% of the cross-border trade in dairy. So, I think we need to be a bit realistic about just our place in the world. Now, what is really important is that the place we hold is very unique and special and privileged. And we shouldn't forget that, because when you look at the world at the moment, the facts have not changed. We might be going through some challenging times, not necessarily so for the dairy industry, but certainly for some other sectors. We're going through some challenging times, but look, global population is still growing. The global middle class is still getting richer. Yes, it's slightly slower than it was, and so people talk about the slowdown in China. I was there with the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago. Yes, growth has slowed down to 6.7%. Most economies would think that was pretty good. I'll talk about China a little bit later. But if you look at the fundamentals around demand for what New Zealand produces, if you look at the quality of our product, the integrity of our supply, our production and supply into the world markets, we're in an unparalleled position. Grass is king. When it comes to the future, grass-fed is absolutely the opportunity for New Zealand. And this is becoming the naturalness component that is so increasingly sought after by so many of the world's discerning consumers. So there are all sorts of opportunities for New Zealand in the big picture to capitalise on what we do very well. And I think we are uniquely placed to do that. We have some work to do. And in fact, I would argue one of the big issues we still have to address is the lack of a new, what I would call pure natural primary sector standard. This is not organics. This is what New Zealand does. It's unique in the world around our grass-fed, our hormone-free, our GM-free, antibiotic-free production systems. The opportunities for a story around that are absolutely compelling. I knew Jeff Ross in the early days when he set up 42 Below, and I really remember one of his quotes around stories and storytelling. He said, marketing's really simple, he said. Develop good stories and great storytelling. And that's what we need to do more. And I think there's a real opportunity for New Zealand around a pure natural standard that has integrity, that also can go to the world alongside our quality products. I just want to talk about the impact of other sectors globally in the big picture, about what's happening, because there was some discussion last night about just why are we seeing some challenges across other sectors, and these are impacting on what's happening in deer. The dairy scene in the world is pretty tough. But look, there's a whole debate about just what's caused all this and what the issues are. And most of the debate, frankly, is about whether this is a structural shift in pricing or a cyclical change in pricing for dairy. It's actually neither. And we actually need to sort of get it into our heads just what's happened with dairy. Because it's impacting on land use here in New Zealand, it's impacting on confidence here in New Zealand, and it is impacting on other sectors' ability, I think, to plan ahead for the long term. So we have been hit in dairy with a series of factors, and I know that people don't want to hear this, but certainly when you look at the issues of quotas coming off in Europe, and of course Rabobank have been leading some of the analysis around this, around what's going to happen in Europe with quotas coming off. We always knew there would be more milk produced in Europe, particularly over 2 or 3 years until that settled down. So look, that shouldn't have been a surprise to anyone, but it certainly had more of an impact than many were predicting. The Russian import ban, the issues we've got with Russia at the moment, are clearly having a major effect on global dairy markets. And of course, Russia used to be the second largest dairy market in the world. In my view, it won't be the big opportunity that was in the past for a whole host of reasons that I won't go into today. The other thing we're seeing, of course, we've seen, as I was reminded in Europe when I was there a month ago, is we've seen increased production out of New Zealand over the last 10 years. So yes, when I go to Europe and say, but our production will be down 2% this year, they say, yeah, but that's on the back of 10 years of serious growth in dairy. So, there's been a whole lot of factors that have contributed there, including a slowdown in China, which, as I say, is a slowdown alongside some building stocks in China as well. So, dairy and sheep meat, in my view, are suffering from what I would call the relatively small slowdown in China. And it shows you how fickle markets are. With very small changes now in supply and demand, the impact they can have on pricing is marked. And in my view, we won't see a rapid improvement in dairy prices or a rapid improvement in sheep meat prices until we see real increase in growth in China. Okay, that's really what it boils down to. So watch for those signals first. Interestingly, and the meat companies I think will all tell you, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, there has been much more increased demand out of China for sheep meat. And so maybe I should cover China off now, because there are a number of things happening in China that provide me with some confidence that demand for our commodities is going to start to increase. Probably not this calendar year, but certainly once we get into 2017. Pork prices in China are up 48% in the last 12 months. Now, for those of you that understand how important pork is in China, I think about 66% of consumption is actually of pork meat in China. Of all meat production is pork in China. It's about 2/3. It's unbelievable. And so when pork prices increase to that extent, it has a major impact on pricing for other proteins in that market. Extraordinary. In China, they had, of course, excess production. They liquidated 100 million boars and 10 million sows over about 18 months. That's the equivalent of the total production of pigs in the USA, Canada, and Mexico combined. So look at these things underneath. Start to look into other sectors to get a sense of, where these markets will be going. But you can see now the demand for secondary cuts in China is now really on the move. Inquiries on the move, because pork has got expensive, pork has got scarce. The policy changes in China have made it increasingly difficult to farm pork. So, these sort of things are going to have a big impact. Right, let me get on to trade and most of the work I do before I talk about TPP, which I think was most of my topic, Dan, by the way, but I'll get on to that in a minute. Look, trade's critical, okay? It's what we do, it's what we need. Look, frankly, we still aren't international enough for the fact, when you consider how much we rely on the world. I'd like to see boards, I'd like to see management teams spending much more time offshore than we currently do. But look, there are 2 aspects to trade I want to cover off. Firstly, the free trade agenda, okay? And that's often what you see me working on around, whether it was the China FTA, whether it was ANZFTA, the ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand Free Trade Agreement, whether it was a Korean FTA, which I've had some discussions with you about, or whether it is what we call plurilateral agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. The free trade agreements that the government-to-government negotiations conclude, they're effectively just the framework, the door opener for commercial companies to then go and do business. So it's the headline issues that we deal with in the FTAs that actually allow us to have more trade opportunities within those particular markets. And so if you look at the FTA agenda, look, this has been very important for New Zealand, because we have to remember about trade, think about trade in historical terms, where trade was built around the concept of food security being delivered by self-sufficiency. Okay, so most countries in the world historically have actually looked at, have actually wanted to make sure they could produce their own food as a way of providing security for the country. But of course, we all now know that that does not happen, that is not possible, and we need to try and look at how we can get more free exchange of food and food products with these global value chains that are developing in food. The free trade agenda does one aspect of that, okay, and that's what the governments do, that's what the ministers do when they negotiate those FTAs, and of course, when it comes to agricultural goods, very often it's not an FTA, okay, particularly for dairy. It is incredibly hard to get full liberalisation of markets for dairy. Dairy is a product that is incredibly heavily protected around the world, and it's very much a social issue in many parts of the world. Once we get the free trade agreements in force and we get the tariff barriers coming down and we get the markets opening up, we then have all the other issues around non-tariff trade barriers. And these will be things like plant certification, plant registration, labelling requirements, SPS, the sanitary phytosanitary standards, that are required before a product can be exported into markets. These are the things that are mushrooming, that are ballooning around the world, the things that are making it incredibly difficult for products to get into markets, even though supposedly a free trade agreement is in place. So, importantly, the government is now here in New Zealand looking at how we can also do the free trade agenda, the actual headline agreements, as well as tackle the non-tariff barriers to markets that we're seeing in all parts of the world. And the presence in China with MPI and Roger Smith and his team up there have done a very good job at actually getting people on the ground to actually deliver on some of those challenges we have in the markets. So, two aspects to it, and both aspects I'm sort of involved in when I go to various countries trying to lay the groundwork for negotiations for the free trade agreements we're talking about. Okay, let me talk about TPP, because I was told reliably last night there are a number of doubters here about TPP in the audience, so I'm not going to embarrass you to put your hands up, but I'm told that there are a number of you, and in fact I didn't think I'd need to go through the TPP debate, but I'm going to. TPP, what is it and why is it so important? Look, I've been closely involved with this and with Minister Tim Grosser with the ministerial negotiations, not in the negotiating room, not doing the negotiations, but at the rounds where we're trying to advocate for a better outcome for TPP. Look, this is absolutely a huge deal for New Zealand. 40% of the world's GDP, 12 member countries including New Zealand, 800 million people in the fastest growing region on earth. There are people here in New Zealand that suggest we shouldn't be in TPP. So you look at those 11 countries and look at what it means for New Zealand. 5 of our top 10 goods markets are countries in TPP. Okay, 5 of our top 10 goods export markets. There are 2 of them in particular where we don't have a free trade agreement with today, okay, the USA and Japan. We would never have got a bilateral or one-on-one FTA agreement with either of those countries if we hadn't been doing it alongside 11 others in TPP. So the reality is, if we weren't in TPP, then frankly we would be walking away from those markets forever. Because TPP for agricultural products has basically got tariffs eliminated on every primary sector product with the exception of dairy into every one of those 11 markets of 40% of the world's GDP over time. every one of 11 markets, just put dairy to one side in a minute, I'm happy to talk about that later, for those 11 markets, for every one of New Zealand's primary sector products. Now, okay, beef is the only other one into Japan where the tariffs drop down and stop at 9%. But, we're talking about tariffs here from 38.5%, snapback tariffs that go to 50% at some time, that will go down to 9%. And importantly, we're on the same deal as every one of those other 11 countries. So I don't want to overstate just how important this is. If we were not in TPP with 11 countries would carry on. Okay, put the US politics to one side in a minute. I'll cover that in a minute. TPP 11 would carry on. Frankly, the other members of TPP would love it if New Zealand was not at the table. They would love it. The big producers in America, the big producers in Canada, Mexico, if you go down into South America, Chile, even the Peruvians, they would love the fact that New Zealand wasn't in TPP because they would have those markets to themselves. So don't underestimate how important it is. The other thing that's really important from my point of view around TPP is that of the 12 member countries, okay, and take us out, 5 of those countries have GDP purchasing power parity higher than New Zealand. And I think this is a point that is often overlooked as well. In the past, we've often done free trade agreements with countries that are poorer than New Zealand. Okay, we're talking about in TPP of doing a deal with 5 countries that are much richer than New Zealand. And if New Zealand's going to make a living and a fortune out of primary sector production, then we need to absolutely be selling to people that are richer than we are. It's why Europe is also so important. I'll talk about that in a minute. The other things about TPP I was asked to clarify was, well, if this is such a good deal for New Zealand, what did we give away? And you would have read, no doubt, the Jane Kelsey excerpts about why TPP is such a bad thing for New Zealand. Well, let me just be very clear about what those issues are and why we did not give away when it came to TPP. Often the ones that are talked about, investor-state dispute settlement. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with the details of this. This is the argument around whether foreign corporations could sue the New Zealand government around any decisions it makes in New Zealand, that might be counter to a foreign corporation's interests. Look, we've got these provisions in every one of our trade agreements that we've signed to date. We've had them there for 30 years. We've never been challenged yet. The New Zealand government's never been challenged yet. You could never say that the risk is not there, but there's no doubt that in a government that has good policy making, that makes rational decisions around legislation, has a good judicial system, I think the chances are very, very low. We've actually managed to, in TPP, have a carve out of tobacco, and that means a plain packaging issue for tobacco, for example, was not an issue where tobacco companies could sue the New Zealand government. So the New Zealand government here is absolutely free to make good policy decisions, good laws in the best interests of the people in New Zealand without fear of being sued through TPP. Second thing is Maritime. I'm meeting with the Maori caucus next week, actually, the Maori Party caucus next week, to try and talk about some of the issues that Maritime have had with TPP. Look, we haven't given the opportunity away for the New Zealand government to be able to make different decisions for Maritime under its treaty obligations for the Treaty of Waitangi. New Zealand was the only country in 12 member countries in TPP that fought and obtained a provision for their Indigenous people. None of the others asked for it, and none of the others have that. So I think Maritime have been very, very favourably treated when it comes to TPP. And the third issue I'll cover off is Pharmac. Everyone said that drugs will be more expensive for Pharmac as a result of TPP. Look, there is no doubt that some of the IP terms and provisions for human medicines, the biologics they call them, and also for animal health products will be extended through the implementation phase of TPP. But the costs are very low. And in fact, the modelling looks to be like we'll need to spend about $4 or $5 million getting an independent panel in place for Pharmac. And then the ongoing cost to the health system, not to taxpayers as individuals, the health system will be about $2 million a year. So yes, if that's high cost for medicines, then that's true, but put that in the context of the total health budget, which is about $350 million a week. So $2 million a year, I think it's a cost that we should actually probably suck up for the benefits we've got in other areas. Okay, let me just, I won't talk about the dairy and TPP because I think I've done dairy enough here, but there's some interesting parallels with that around Korea, with what we talked about as well. I just want to talk about other trade priorities because I was asked about that. I've been to Europe once this year for 2 weeks to look at the Europe Free Trade Agreement. If you've been watching the news, you will have seen that there's been quite a lot of discussion about a free trade agreement between Europe and New Zealand. And look, I say this quite openly in that we have been unfairly treated with Europe, and we're looking to see that to be readdressed. If you look at the World Trade Organization, and there's about 160 member countries in the WTO, there are only 6 of those WTO member countries that either don't have an FTA with Europe or one under negotiation. Only 6 out of 160. And those countries are Russia, China, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, and Chinese Taipei, Australia and New Zealand. So, I sort of go to Europe and I say, look, this doesn't feel quite right. This is a country that has supported Europe through wars and a whole lot of, whole history of goodwill, between our country and Europe, and we don't have an FTA or one under negotiation with Europe. And thankfully, we are now moving down that path. And someone asked last night why we haven't been in the process of doing an FTA, and I think, frankly, it's probably because we've just had such a long history with Europe, we've had good relationships with Europe, and we haven't really felt the need to push hard for an FTA of the sort we're looking for now. But it's going to be really, really tough. The conditions in Europe are brutal at the moment. Migration, I was in Turkey as well before I went to Europe. The migration and the migrant issue coming out of Syria is a major problem. The politics in Europe are becoming much more inward looking as people try to protect themselves around the security concerns that they're now facing. And then, of course, you've got the Brexit vote coming up on the 23rd of June as well, which is creating all sorts of uncertainty. Europe's a difficult place, but look, we are pushing hard, and we do still think that there's logical reasons for why we can get an FTA with Europe quite soon. Okay, Europe's important. We're still working on India, and I think with India and China, we need to remember it's about 300 million middle class in India and China, so we just can't forget those markets. But as I say, in China 2 weeks ago with the PM, who did a fantastic job. I know you've talked about chilled into China, happy to cover that in questions later, but when you look at China, we were there in 1 week. They have a delegation a week going to China, and 124 countries call China their number 1 market. So, when we talk about wanting to get inspectors down here to inspect plants around chilled access, just think that every one of those countries is probably asking the same. So, some real interesting challenges there. Andy, hopefully we've got time for questions. I'll leave it there and just say, look, we're continuing to work hard on the market access. It's crucially important for New Zealand. I know the dairy industry, needs better access, even though the tariff barriers haven't been historically high. Look, I'm happy to take any questions on any of the issues that I've raised above. Thanks.
Okay, time for 2 quick questions. Colin first.
Graham. Yeah, thanks, Mike. I have to say it makes me proud to be a New Zealand farmer when we see somebody with your professionalism, ability out representing us in other countries. So thanks very much for all the work you do. That's not my question, but a couple of questions.
I was going to say yes.
Couple of questions. No. I wonder if you can just expand on your comment about New Zealand pure and grass-fed.
Yeah.
Because I remember way back in the dim dark past, Professor Walker at Lincoln actually talking about this many years ago,
yeah.
And we've done nothing about it. So if you could perhaps comment a bit more on what the real chances of that are.
Okay.
The other one is, I wonder if you could just drill down a bit more into the pork story in China and why that actually happened.
Yep.
And what the implications, you've probably outlined the implications, what it means, but why did it happen and is it a one-off or a sustainable issue?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, look, quickly on the pork one. Look, there was a whole lot of policy change in China around trying to clean up the pork industry. And in fact, a lot of the policy change was directed at what they thought was going to help improve their supply of pork, the security of supply for pork, by incentivising larger big commercial companies to produce pigs. You might have seen, when was that, 6 months ago, a whole lot of pigs floating down the river, in Beijing or Shanghai, I can't remember which one it was. That was the small producers basically just protesting against the policies that were incentivising the big producers, and they basically tipped their pigs in the river because they could not make any money out of it. So pork prices have got very low, and so the small producers were effectively put out of business. And now, of course, it's swung around to the opposite, where there's a shortage of pork, and that's why prices have gone very high. Not likely to change anytime soon. The pure natural thing, look, and this is something that we are not doing fast enough and well enough. So other countries have caught on to this. Ireland, and people get sick of me talking about Origin Green, the Ireland promotional program. It's fantastic. Go and have a look at it online. It could be New Zealand. It could be exactly what we do here in New Zealand. Origin Green's very, very smart. It's around providing an assurance from production through to the market around the credentials of their sustainability programs, including carbon footprinting every farm in Ireland. Okay, and then every company has to provide a sustainability plan before they can be accredited Origin Green. Other countries are doing this better than we are. 100% pure is gone, okay, we're not using that anymore. The New Zealand story is there, and they're doing some really good stuff around the imagery and what we need to do, but we've got to back it up with some validated stats around the integrity of our production.
Sorry, guys, I'm going to have to cut it off
Andy.
there. Look, I don't think we could have got a better rundown on this whole issue in half an hour. Mike's got to get back to Hawke's Bay tonight for a funeral, so make the most of him in the next couple of breaks, and I'm sure he's available to talk to people on by email or phone anyway. He's very available. Obviously, he's got some of the best knowledge in the world in this area. So thanks, Mike. Really appreciate your input.
Ed.